I could live up to that. Yeah, look, thanks for having me here, and I'm quite humbled by all of that. It makes me sound like Mother Teresa, but I'm not. But I'll tell you a bit about how we got here. But look, I also wanted to, I guess, applaud Jeff and the guys behind PDF and those of you who are regularly involved, because I think it's an awesome initiative, I suppose, to provide. I think it really started as a, if you like, a career support group for young. You started the Asian professionals was the thing, and then it's broadened out to sort of professionals with a cultural, diverse cultural background, and I think going broader still. So certainly our meeting of minds was very much around how do we help and support people from diverse cultural backgrounds succeed in the Australian marketplace. Because to Jeff's point, the frustration that I had, the two candidates that I put up were typically a domestic one and an international / culturally diverse in accounting was very much Asian and Indian backgrounds. And I thought some of these kids were absolutely terrific, often Australian degree, and I was constantly frustrated that the domestic student would often, or the domestic candidate would often get an opportunity, and the international candidate was overlooked. And I was really puzzled and frustrated by that. And I guess that's where my journey started to really try and understand it. Now, so I've got a fair bit to get through. I've never done this presentation before. It is a subject that I'm really passionate about. I'm going to look down at my notes occasionally because I can speak for about 48 hours on this. But I want to make sure, I'm not going to, don't worry. I just want to make sure I don't miss any terrific gems and gold nuggets that I thought of when I was putting this together. So one of the things I want to talk about is this disconnect between education and employment outcomes, and kind of how it's this sort of self-reinforcing system, if you like. It sounds like it's overcomplicating it, but really it's a self-fulfilling cycle in many ways. So I'll talk a bit about that and how it's kind of hard to break it, but then we'll talk at the end about some ways that I think we can all contribute to how it can be broken. I don't know if I'll change everyone's view of the world. I think again, he's a fabulous salesman, But what hopefully I can do is give you a glimpse as to some stuff that's going on in the employment and education markets that's leading to unfair, sort of unwise outcomes in Australia at the moment. Now, the bulk of what we do at Performance Education is really geared around fresh graduates and undergraduates and first-timers breaking into the workforce. So the bulk of, I guess, my expertise and understanding is really helping that kind of early stage, international student who's moving out of a university or a vocational program, and very much centred around the international student market. When Jeff and I were sort of preparing for this and we saw that list of people coming along, one thing I flagged was I said, hey, hang on, a lot of these guys are already well progressing through their career and getting started. So I want to kind of explain that's kind of the context of my knowledge, but also we reworked it a bit to make sure that it's as relevant as we can for all of you. And I think there's a big role to play for the students themselves, but there's also a big role to play for employers, managers, mentors, in terms of the message and understanding what's going on and changing the way we do things. So I hope it's going to be relevant. It's such a big mix of experiences just from the people I've spoken to so far, so bear with me. Take questions, comments at the end, or if you're lost, sing out, and I'm happy to help. All right, I have to do two things. So we talked about telling the truth. I think really just the message I would say is, this is my truth, this is my experience. You'll have your own choices and views. I've probably just banged that. Absolutely up to you to make your own calls and considerations. I guess my piece is around the truth and the facts, I suppose, that are going to make a difference to career outcomes. This is not about building communities. This is not about building charities. This is about, what do you need to know to have a successful career in Australia? That's the full extent of it. I don't profess to kind of know more than that. So that's where I'll just want to be really blunt about some things, and I really hope that no one takes offence. This is really just some stuff that's been going on, and that a lot of the time, because of political correctness, doesn't get talked about. So I was running my accounting recruitment firm, as Jeff said, and I saw this increasingly diverse talent pool coming through, and that was really driven by the drive in Australia to build up the international student portfolio within the university system, because the government was cutting funding in the university system, and the international student pool was growing. And so we saw, particularly in accounting, and today 75% of all graduates in Australian universities in accounting are international students. So that's fine. That's we need that diversity of talent. As I said, the problem was when they came out, there was a real disconnect in their employment outcomes. Despite some great talent, some great results, some great attitudes, some really keen young talent, they weren't getting interviews, and when they were getting interviews, they weren't often getting the jobs. So, and I spoke to my peers in the recruitment industry, and they were saying it was the same in IT and engineering and a number of other fields. So I thought, okay, this is pretty endemic. And we were seeing also a lot of people. I do this funny thing where I talk to cab drivers. And when I was getting really interested in this space, I was talking to a lot of cab drivers, and there's a lot of people from India and Asia and stuff driving cabs. And I'd have a chat to them about how did they end up driving a cab? Where did they come from? What are they doing here? And I swear to you, about 90% were saying, I studied IT or accounting or engineering. I'm like, okay, what are you doing driving a cab? They'd say, well, and they'd happily tell me their story. And the story was that they left university with a degree in Australia, good degree, and they knocked on the doors of recruitment firms and employers, and they applied and they applied and they applied and they applied and they applied. They still to this day do not know why they didn't get a job. They've probably got some theories which we'll talk about. They gave up, and they had this taxi job before when they were studying, or they had this job at 7-Eleven or whatever it was, and 50 grand a year, that's okay, I can live on that. I'm kind of exhausted trying this other process. I'm probably feeling a bit humiliated, a bit downtrodden, and I'm just going to do this. And then after 2 or 3 or 4 years of that, it's kind of, they feel it's too late. Their degree was a bit old. They've lost their kind of drive. So I saw this is really odd. So these people have spent all this money because, some of you will have paid full fees for study in Australia, and it's funding the entire education system. Yet there was this massive disconnect between where people studied and where they ended up. And it was more than the minority in my experience, particularly in those spaces. So it just didn't seem fair, didn't seem sustainable to me. So the first thing that popped into my head is, well, I wonder if Australian employers are racist. I'm probably not the only person that's ever crossed their mind, and certainly that cab driver, I bet it crossed his mind. But from my experience, that's not the case. I actually think it's a really convenient explanation that masks a more complicated explanation. I'm going to share the more complicated explanation with you today. But in my very specific experience dealing with hundreds, if not thousands, of Australian employers, both in my recruitment business, and we work with about 1,400 host companies placing international students in internships at Performance Education. From working with them, I genuinely believe there is a very small minority somewhere in the country that is genuinely racist. And I genuinely believe that there's a bunch of other reasons why they behave the way they do and make the choices that they make. So we're going to talk about that. These guys, truly racist. Nut jobs and truly racist. No question in my mind. Australian employers, not so. So, and this is where it gets all a bit stereotypical and generalised, but it's the easiest way for me to get the message across. So I'm going to pick 3 pretend people. We've got Brian, the employer, James, the candidate, and Jun, the candidate. Both went to uni at Macquarie University. James is the one who keeps, getting the interviews, and he's the sort of the guy that I experienced would win out time and time again over Jun, even if Jun had better grades, and even if Jun had a better attitude. And I actually think they would do the job better. We used to do technical skills training. Not many recruiters do this, but we were in accounting. I'm an accountant by profession, so we used to put the students through a battery of accounting tests. I know, really separated them out. But often, Jun would have a better score. I'm like, well, he knows his stuff better. And again, time and again, Jun wouldn't get up. And to understand, we need to understand where Brian's coming from first and foremost. So, first of all, let's look at what's on Brian's plate. So Brian is a hiring manager. He's not the CEO. He's a hiring manager within an organisation. Hiring people is a risky business. It's easy to get wrong, and it's a risk for the organisation, but it's also a risk for his own position and his success. You get it wrong, you can mess some things up within your organisation, you don't meet deadlines. It reflects on his performance and his bonus, say, his career path. Brian's time poor, like all people and all managers within businesses. So recruitment's an inconvenience, and he wants it to happen really quickly. Brian, generally in my experience, is also not trained in recruitment and selection. He goes through a bit of a process, whether it's one he made up himself or the one that HR gave to him, but he's actually not trained in it at all, even though it's quite difficult. And Brian certainly isn't trained in cross-cultural awareness. So he doesn't appreciate necessarily where other cultures are coming from in their behaviour, and quite likely isn't attuned to different accents and perhaps more open to different levels of communication skills. So it doesn't set a good framework so far, does it, for Jun? The other thing is hiring is actually really difficult. Getting it right is difficult because everyone thinks, well, I've got the skills. All you need is, what skills do you need for this job? It's the first thing a hiring manager will write down. It's the easiest thing to recruit to. Easiest thing. Do you have the skills? Don't you have the skills? It's really easy to assess. That's like 25% of the battle. The rest is actually looking at people's characteristics, their inherent manner and their inherent core characteristic competencies. Are they proactive? Are they committed? Are they hungry to learn? Their interpersonal style, the way they go about things. What are their inherent values, and do they match with the values of the organisation? And ultimately, do they fit with Brian? He's got to get along with them personally, whether he's a nice person or not. He's just got to decide whether there's a connection there. His team, maybe it's the finance team, maybe it's an IT team, and the company overall, there has to be fit at 3 different levels. So this is actually now really, really complicated. And back in the day when we had much more hierarchical businesses, and to some extent that still exists in some other countries, it wasn't very much about skills and did you turn up and do your job. And in more contemporary organisations, and particularly in more Western countries, this whole package is important. In fact, I'd argue that the bottom ones are more powerful and more important than the top one. Yes, you've got to be able to do the job, but I have seen people strong here and weak here and they get the job. So it's very complicated. So this is the kind of framework that's facing Brian as he considers his recruitment process. So he can't just look at something on a piece of paper. He's really got to actually get to know the candidates, right? Makes sense. There's a lot to understand, there's a lot to get wrong and right, and there's a lot to kind of dig into. So how does he get to know the candidates? Well, unfortunately, we still run, 99% of companies will still run a very traditional recruitment process that's been around for probably hundreds of years. And we're still, with a bit of technology overlaid, we're still following the same basic process. So I like to talk about recruitment like dating. It is the best analogy for recruitment, and everybody seems to understand dating, and most people struggle to understand the recruitment process. They are so similar, it's not funny. So let's start with first impressions. So keeping in mind we've got our two candidates, they're going through a process with Brian. What's the first impression in a normal recruitment process? Let's say he's putting an ad up on Seek. What's the first impression that Brian gets of Jun and James? I'm willing to give it a go. Cover letter. Name. Interesting. Name. I like name, that's good. Font. Well, suburb. No, he's going to have to dig for that. That's third impression. So, but it won't come on paper. Email address. Having read thousands of resumes in my recruitment days, the first thing that pops up typically either in a recruitment system from all the applications that have come in through Seek or into your inbox is email address and then subject. Now, you know the subject because it says it's automated and it says, assistant accountant, job number, blah, blah, blah. So the only differentiator in that first list is email address. So, the name thing can actually come into that because his first impression might be, I'm actually struggling to pronounce it, right? It's a foreign sounding name. Now, so, and Jun's not a hard one, but, I've seen some that I really struggle to understand. I need someone to tell me, how do you pronounce that? Now, Mr. Time Poor Brian may not be that willing to go and find someone who can help him figure out how to pronounce it, and maybe he's feeling a bit uncomfortable already. Now, he's not a racist guy, but this is kind of a bit weird for him, a bit uncomfortable. So when there's 5,000 applicants coming in for a graduate program, and I believe that the big accounting firms get something like that, they're looking for every single reason to move on to the next candidate and cull the candidate. So it can be as crazy as the name. We counsel our students to not use, hotsexydoggy@hotmail.com.au. May just give the wrong impression. But then it is moving on to the actual application itself. And if there are grammar issues, if there are spelling issues, if there are, obvious written communication skill issues, bang, just looking for a reason to cull you out. So in this situation, the application process is all about written communication skills. And if Jun hasn't done a ton of work to lift his written communication skills to near the level of James, who has the advantage of just growing up in the country and being a native English speaker, then he's at a disadvantage straight off the bat. And you can understand the context of that without Brian being racist. Does that make sense? So that's not a good start. So let's talk about the interview. So the interview is like the next stage in the dating process. It's our first date. It's probably a short date. You don't want to make it too long. Could get uncomfortable. Maybe you don't like them. So the first interview might only be 30 minutes. And it's a chance for the hiring manager and the candidate to kind of get to know one another, because there's a bunch of stuff you need to know, not just where you got a degree and what degree you had. So you're trying to find out about them. And you're trying to find out, are they a good match? And frankly, do I want to hang out with them? Right? You want to do that in a date, but you also want to do that in employment, because you're choosing to perhaps spend the next 2 to 5 years with this person. It's a pretty serious commitment. And in some cases, people spend more time at work than at home. Many of us do. And so you're going to spend more time with this person than your partner at home, or your family, or your dog. So this date, this first interview, is really important in kind of understanding one another and getting to know one another. Now, imagine a first date with someone who cannot speak your language. Has anyone ever had a similar experience like that? Have you? Yeah. How'd that go? Tricky, right? honestly, whatever language it may be, if you actually can't communicate on a common language, apart from, sounds like, doing charades, you're probably going to struggle to get to know one another. And it's about, this process is about building a relationship. It's about what hobbies do you have, what music do you like, where do you, who are you, what's your background, all that sort of stuff. The interview process is very similar. They're trying to get to know one another. And I guarantee you cannot get to know someone effectively without being able to communicate effectively. And at this stage of the process, it's all about verbal communication skills and what we call non-verbal communication skills, which is sign language, body language. Body language. So, how you kind of behave and react and your, facial expressions and so on. And they can vary quite culturally as well. So again, you can see, I think in a situation like this, now I'm not suggesting that Jun can't speak in English, because that's not the case. Jun's gone through university, he got IELTS 6 or 6.5. As far as the government's concerned, his English is perfectly acceptable in the workplace. As far as I'm concerned, it's not. And that's from absolute experience, and some of my guys up the back would perfectly agree that that's not enough to work in a professional and technical workplace. So they can communicate, but they can't communicate effectively. So Brian may struggle to get to know Jun. Now, some might be sitting there saying, well, James might be a crap communicator as well. And that's absolutely true. So, happily apply these truisms to domestic candidates as well, because they have their own issues. But without exception, on average, it's much more of a struggle and a battle for someone who hasn't had English as a first language, without question. So, that's why I'm focused on them, and, we'll help the domestic students down the track. So, again, Jun may be at a disadvantage. Now we're at the third or fourth date. We'll call it the second interview. And this is the point where, and rarely do you get away with one interview these days. So at the second or third interview, this is about third or fourth date, making a bit of a decision about the future. Do I really want to commit to this person? Because what are we doing? We've had 4 dates. Do we want to carry on or not? Do we want to get serious or not? So this is really about getting to know the person at a deeper level. And so what the young lady here is thinking about is something like, can I see myself with this person going forward? Would they get along with my family? In recruitment terms, that's about, I don't know if you can read that, that's about fit. Will they fit? She's thinking about, how does he behave? How would he act in certain situations? As a hiring manager, you're thinking about this person's characteristics that we had up on the slide. Would they be good at the job of being a husband? Can he take bins out? Can he repair tables? I don't know. She's thinking about his skills. And do we have enough in common would probably be another thing. And another way of talking about that we do in recruitment is, do we have enough shared values that's going to get us through the tough times? And will we see eye to eye on most things? So these are difficult things to understand. I don't think it's going well, by the way, because he's ignoring her. So I'm suspecting there's perhaps a shared values difference, at least. So to get a sense of that, there has to be communication, not looking at your phone. There has to be an actual dialogue and communication to understand one another. And I think there's 2 things at play here that disadvantage Jun. One is, Jun looks different to Brian. Jun's from a different background to Brian. So instantly, I think, there's potentially less obvious things in common. Now, that might not be true. They might both have 4 common hobbies. But at a visual level, and perhaps on the very surface, it looks like there's differences. So there's an immediate kind of, perhaps, lack of commonality. It's like that old thing when you're travelling and I hear an Australian accent in a pub in the UK, and you're like, actually, pub in the UK that's full of Australian accents, in Nepal, and I'd be like, wow, we've got something in common. At Australia, I probably wouldn't look at them twice. So that lack of commonality can be a barrier, or perceived commonality can be a barrier to this process. And secondly, going back to the communication skills, again, if you can't have a really effective flowing conversation, it's really hard to understand this stuff. And this is the stuff that Brian needs to get right, because otherwise he might get sacked or not get his bonus or something like that. Does that make sense? So I guess just to kind of recap that whole thing about the recruitment process before we move on to the next bit, is that he's looking for to know, he just wants to know the candidate's going to be effective, so good output, they're reliable, etc., and they're going to fit. And it's these skills and characteristics, which do overlap, that's going to help him determine that. The other thing I'll point out is that communication is a core skill. It's not just a fundamental part of the recruitment process, as you can see. It's all about communication. It's a core skill to do the job. I do not know one job in a professional context that doesn't require you to have strong communication skills. Once upon a time when accountants were locked in the basement and they wrote on spreadsheets that were actually bits of paper, and they were down in the dungeon and it was dark and they sat down there with rubbers and didn't talk to anyone, maybe, I don't know how long ago that was, 80 years ago, maybe longer. These days they are expected to interact, they're expected to build relationships, they're expected to deal with external, internal customers, part of cross-functional teams. All of that stuff requires really strong communication skills. All right. So what I've just tried to do is I'm summarising some things as we go so we can build a bit of a picture of the system. You'll see that at the beginning I talked about the system, and on the original flyer that went out, the system is broken. But what is the system that I'm talking about? So let's build up a little bit of a picture. So we've talked about that communication is a core competency. We need to accept that fact. We've talked about that fit is critical to success in a career in Australia. For me, unquestionable truth. We've talked about that the recruitment process is fundamentally underpinned, being successful in it is underpinned by effective communication, both verbal, non-verbal and written. And in effect, the recruitment process leads a hiring manager to be a bit more about form than substance. And that kind of goes to the heart of the matter around, say, Jun versus James. And if Jun is actually a better candidate in substance, but the form for Brian is a bit, different, then again, Jun is at a disadvantage. So this is the way traditional recruitment leads us. We talked about hiring is time consuming. So Brian wants the path of least resistance. Now I'm talking about Brian, but I could be talking about a recruiter. Probably even more so with recruiters because they're managing 20, 30 jobs at any one time. It's quick, simple, cut through. They don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about figuring out how to pronounce someone's name. Is that wrong? Probably. But they do it because they're in a rush. They get paid when they get someone placed. They get a fee and the recruiter gets commission. The hiring manager just doesn't have time. He's got to make a decision. He wants to make the right decision, but he just doesn't want to go down a path that's kind of too hard if he can avoid it. So it leads them to the path of least resistance, which again, I think favours James over Jun. And hiring is risky, as we've said, so it favours the safe option, the lower risk option, what feels safe and what feels familiar to Brian. Naturally, it is a natural disposition to feel safe and familiar with someone that kind of looks like you, or someone whose cultural background you understand. Is that wrong? Probably. Is that what's happening? I think so. So, Jun didn't get the job. Let's see what Brian says to Jun when he rings up and says, so I just want to understand why I didn't get the job. Brian is put on the spot. Brian's feeling a little bit awkward and he says, you don't have any local experience. That's it. Because that's a fact. That's a fact on Jun's resume. Good? Okay. Thanks. Bye. So that's true. Jun didn't have any local experience. What's Brian really thinking? I really had trouble understanding him. Now that's both on a communication level, but on a understanding him, getting to know him, like what we just talked about through the dating process. So why doesn't he say that to Jun?
He doesn't want to get sued.
Why would he get sued?
Because racial discrimination.
Absolutely. Absolutely. He's paranoid as an employer and as a manager about being discriminatory. But we've said that we've agreed, I think, that communication skills are a core competency. And if you look at the definition of discrimination, if I get this right, someone will check and email me, I'm sure, is that if it's a core requirement or core competency of the role, then you can't be discriminated against for not having it. And you ask any employer, is communication skills a core competency, critical requirement of the role? 99.9% will say yes. And if you look at, there's all sorts of surveys that put it right at the top. So if he were to say to him, Jun, look, I've just got to be honest with you, I don't believe that your English skills were at a level that I require for this role. Not discriminatory. Not discrimination at all. It's a fact and it's a core competency. You would rarely ever find an employer who's willing to have that conversation for that reason, or they're just plain uncomfortable about having the conversation and they're not trained to do it. And certainly recruiters in the same boat. So now Jun didn't learn that bit. All Jun's focused on is I need to get local experience. How does Jun get local experience without having local experience? He's in a loop. He can't get a job because he hasn't had a job. We'll talk about internships later because it's a good way to break that cycle, but that's not the point. He probably won't get an internship if his communication skills aren't at a sufficient enough level. So I call that the convenient truth. So we go back to our little model thingy here. Jun has a lack of awareness about this, and he's got a lack of awareness because other people are feeling uncomfortable. They fear discrimination and they're trying to be politically correct. But I actually think it does Jun a disservice. So there's no feedback loop from this kind of recruitment process to Jun to understand what's going on. And I often find in our organisation, we talk to a lot of graduates, and I often find in the presentations and training that we do, it's the first time they've heard it. It's like a massive aha moment. And it really sort of surprises me that they hadn't got there. Now that I've looked into this, not so much. So Jun now doesn't seek out a training solution to his skill gaps, as he would if the client had said, Jun, your Excel skills aren't at advanced. I need them to be at advanced. They're only at basic. What would Jun do? If he's smart, he'd go and do an Excel course. If he's smart and he knew, he'd probably go and do something about his communication skills to get them up to the appropriate level. And there's stuff that he could do about developing his fit and his cross-cultural integration, which we'll talk about in a minute. So what else is going on here? Same thing, same response. What's Brian really thinking? You read that up the back? I hired a few Chinese guys once and it didn't work out. Wrong on so many levels. But it happens. It absolutely happens. Now, I'm going to tell you I don't think Brian's racist still. I think he's confused. But Brian is working off learning. So hiring managers, like most human beings, learn from experience. And he's had an experience that he now kind of ties into Jun, because Jun's Chinese. I don't know if Jun's Chinese, but I knew someone was going to get me on that. Well, interestingly, Brian probably wouldn't know. So now he's kind of attached the two things, and it feels like more of a risk because he's had some issues before. I can tell you that this concept came from reality. So I'm going to tell you something that's awful and shocking and can't leave this room apart from we're videoing it. I had conversations with employers when I was a recruiter, and we went through the briefing process, and they said, I need a financial accountant or an assistant accountant, whatever, and we've got all that stuff, and this is the stuff about the organisation, the role, and the salary, and all that sort of stuff. And then the hiring manager would reach over the table and he'd say very quietly, but don't send me any Asians or Indians. I swear that is absolutely true and happened multiple times. So I'm like, okay, apart from the fact that that's illegal, I didn't want to lose the client, let me understand why you're saying that. And you say, well, I hired an Indian once and it didn't work out. Okay, why? Well, he really didn't fit in. Or his communication skills, we just really had trouble understanding him, and he didn't really understand the directions, and he did things wrong, and look, we had to let him go. Okay. To which I'd reply in my head, ever hired an Aussie that didn't work? You're still hiring them. So, the argument is absurd. It's nonsensical. But it's there. It's in their head. And suddenly they're kind of attaching this to someone who they don't really know, but they didn't really get to know him because perhaps he did have a communication skill deficiency. There was a communication skill gap. So, it's not an ideal situation. And again, this isn't helping Jun's situation at all. So I call it the compounding effect of bad experiences because now there's a bad experience with the employer. Now there were some genuine skill issues. I'm not overlooking the fact that Jun's communication skills weren't up to the level they needed to be, and he showed he had challenges, I guess, fitting in with Brian in the conversations, and potentially there was some cultural stuff underpinning that he wasn't even aware of. And so now Brian, from his past experience, has seen those triggers and says, well, I've had that before, I've had that combination, and they didn't perform, and I had to get rid of them. And my bonus is at risk again. So that's too risky for me because hiring is risky. And now I want to go the safe option, and it's too hard. So you see what's happening. This is a compounding thing. And so again, it feels a bit like racism, and it's certainly, I want to say ignorant, but it's experiential. So it compounds this thing down here, and it sort of reinforces. And this is my point, because you're kind of like, this is absurd. Why does this keep happening? And it's kind of a compounding effect. There's another piece to it as well. So let's take a step back and say, if this is so absurd, and it's kind of obvious, right? What I'm saying isn't, I'm not telling you how to split the atom. This is pretty obvious stuff. It makes logical sense to most people. You look at the dating thing, okay, that makes sense. So why hasn't someone had a conversation with Jun about this and said, this is really, really important. If you want to have a career in Australia as an IT professional, you need to know this stuff and you need to work on it. Well, possibly it's clearly not Jun's parents, but possibly Jun's parents live overseas and haven't had exposure to the Australian workplace. There are culturally, there are countries where if it's that have a belief where if you get good qualifications, you work hard, those other things aren't as significant. And I know that because I talk to students who've been told that. And there's also a myth that still floats around that, you know, if you be an accountant or an IT, you don't need good communication skills like we talked before. So kind of coming in thinking, well, that's not important. What I need is a good degree. I need to work hard and I need to get good grades. So that's what I know, and my parents know everything, so I'm gonna take that on face value. There's other influences in this, and again, we deal with international students, and it's the biggest source of skilled migration in Australia, so it's very relevant to this whole process. Working with migration agents and education agents, they are huge influences, I believe, to international students. Why aren't they having the conversation? We work with hundreds of them, and I don't believe that many of them ever have a conversation around this stuff, because what are they charged with? They're charged with either getting them the right visas or getting them education, getting them into university. It's not their remit. And I think also often a bunch of them are offshore, so they've got no exposure to the Australian workplace, the real exposure, other than what they read on the internet about kangaroos running down George Street. Or they're onshore, but they come from, they're migrants themselves. So many of our agents are migrants themselves who've never actually kind of worked in the Australian corporate world, but they've started their own migration agency. So there's a limited kind of understanding in the other people that influence. So what they do is they go down the road. So it's all kind of self-reinforcing information. What about the government? We should be able to rely on the government to solve the problems. Well, alas, you may be surprised to know not so much. The government does encourage minimum language levels through IELTS and other testing scores. There's now 4 language tests that are acceptable to the government. Not one of them is designed for business or the workplace. What's the end goal here? Is it to get into a job? You know, in most cases it is. So they're actually pretty inappropriate tests, and the standards and levels are pretty low. And it's also pretty easy to hothouse people through to pass the test without actually building good fundamental communication skills. So that's not really helping, and certainly in my experience the government is not getting the message out there to say, if you're going to come to Australia and study, and if you want a career in Australia, you need to think about these other skills that you need to develop. What it is the English language stuff that is done is to get you to a minimum level that gets you into university. You know, the interesting about that is I think most universities are 6 or 6.5 on the IELTS scale, which isn't particularly high in my opinion. There's been a bunch of studies done that shows that the IELTS score degrades in the 2 to 3 years that an international student is at university here. That is a shocker. That is a shocker. I met with a senior lecturer at UNSW in accounting, and she said, I had a conversation about this stuff like I did with Jeffrey, and she's like, yes, I hear this is a real problem. She said, did you know my textbook, she has a textbook for her course, she said, you know, the second-hand version of my textbook is more expensive than the new one. I'm like, what? You're going to guess. It's got translations in the margin. Now, isn't that missing the point? Given that most of these students actually want to stay and work and have a successful career in Australia as an accountant, they're missing the point because no one's had the conversation with them. So that awareness piece is huge. We touched on this already. Dear old universities. We have great universities in Australia and academically wonderful and rigorous and research and nice old buildings and beautiful things of grass. You can have a lovely experience at university here in Australia. But they don't believe that their job is to prepare you for employment, most of them. I read a quote or heard a quote the other day that said, that's the job of the vocational industry. The vet industry, the vocational, meaning employment. Not universities, meaning qualification, education. But really, what's the point of the qualification and education for most people? It's to get a job, employment. And you know, this has been kind of stuck in the university system for a long time. We deal with a lot of universities as well, and there are some that are getting with the program. They're waking up to the fact that they're graduates have to be more job ready. We're doing some great work with Macquarie University, and that's why I kind of use them, because I think they're really breaking some ground. But we're working with their accounting faculty to help their students become job ready. They recognise they actually don't know how to get them job ready, so they bring us in. So that's cool. Something's happening at least for their accounting students, but that's not the norm, and they are very much, I think, at the forefront of this stuff. And I reckon it's going to take 5 or 10 years for most of the industry to come along. So not hearing it from the universities because they don't think it's their job. Consequently, they've got rubbish career officers. I don't know if anyone's ever been to a careers office there. I mean, God bless the people that are working in there. I'm not knocking them, but they're underfunded, unloved. 2 people to support 5,000 students. Those 2 dear careers officers probably haven't been in the employment market for 50 years. I'm being so cruel, and I apologise if there's any in this room. We certainly won't be working with that university. But I feel for them. And they've got really crap resources and information. So it's not coming through there. We've talked about IELTS. The other thing that's pretty controversial is I think the universities encourage self-segregation. And it's one of the reasons why the IELTS score degrades, is because universities are wonderfully democratic places, and they want to foster, they want to embrace international students because frankly they're paying their wages. They're funding the joint without question. So we embrace international students, and we want you to basically, or we encourage you to stay in your communities and with your ethnic groups. What we don't do is we don't discourage that, because that would be seen to be politically incorrect. But if we were to have a conversation that said, developing your communication skills is critical. In fact, it's more critical than you doing that tax subject, as if they're going to say that. I would. It's more critical than that tax subject, because it doesn't matter how good your tax skills are, if you cannot communicate effectively in the employment process, you are not going to get the job. So if they had that conversation and they said, we really would encourage you, therefore, with all due respect to your community, we would encourage you to mingle with a whole bunch of people, and particularly where you get opportunities to really practice your English skills. And I don't think that conversation's had very often. And the research bears that out. So the last piece in my little system chart thing that I made up is this, the education system. It's kind of the link that's not working. And it's because, as I said, technical focus, not about soft skills. I don't even like the term soft skills, but I couldn't fit it in the little box. Because they're not, soft makes it sound like, nah, optional. They're not optional. And not about employment outcomes. So what happens is, Jun, who's done a terrific degree, I shouldn't have used Macquarie Uni for his one, should I? He's now come out with, he's underskilled. He's not job ready. And the employer has a bad experience with him in the interview. And if he hires him, maybe he has a bad experience with him in the workplace. So here we go again with this self-fulfilling kind of process. Because Jun wasn't aware, he didn't seek out the training. He didn't seek out the training, so he's not skilled enough, so there's a bad experience, so the hiring manager thinks this is risky, and around we go. A perpetual cycle. So why hasn't this been obvious to people? Well, I think it's kind of one of those things where that was a little bit complicated. If I showed you that straight off and hadn't taken you through the journey, it's a bit, don't really understand how that all works. It's actually not that hard, but because it's a whole bunch of things all working together, it's kind of hard to see which bit of the system or the machine is breaking down and how all the pieces come together and what's contributing to the failure. The other thing is there's no single body, organisation, person that's responsible for that whole thing. And in my experience, not many people move from recruitment to education. I happened to, and I saw it like it was just bright as day. And I'm sure there's a few out there that do as well, but not that many. They kind of really don't want to hang out together. And occasionally a university will have a recruiter come and talk to the students, or they bring in someone from business. but it's pretty contrived and it's pretty rare. So these things are blind spots, and because it's self-reinforcing and because it's a blind spot, it keeps happening. Does that make sense? Yes. So the obvious question, what can be done about it? Now, again, I'm not about changing the world single-handedly, but I am about just saying, there must be stuff we can do. We're busily doing it in our organisation through training programs and just having this bloody conversation. Telling 60 of you that might go and tell 20 other people. It's on video, I don't know where that's going to go. Oops, sorry. Oh, well, we'll jump to that one. Now, this is a range of ideas, thoughts, actions. I sort of call them success points. That some of it will apply to you as an individual, some might apply to some people you mentor, but I've thrown them out there in terms of answers. So for me, the first one is adapt to succeed. So you can put your feet in the ground and say, well, this is wrong. What I've just said is wrong. The situation is wrong. Universities should be fixing this. They should be. Governments should be saying something. Employers shouldn't be so stupid. You can do that. You might not have the career success you otherwise would because you can't control what others do. And if you wait around for the university to change, or if you wait around for Brian to be more broad-minded, your career might be half over. So personally, I'm all about taking control of what I can control. So it's much quicker for you to adapt. I'll give you a quick example. There was a study done by Deakin University by a colleague of mine, and it was about the plight of international accounting students. And they interviewed a whole bunch of them, and some had been successful, some had gone home, some had done okay, some hadn't done okay. And this one girl stuck in my mind. She'd done really well. She presented really well. They were all videos, and she got a job at Deloitte, I think, in Melbourne. And through the process, they were asking all about what she did and didn't do. And she told the interviewer that she joined the rowing club at university. And he said, oh, that's a bit unusual. Why'd you join the rowing? You little girl, why'd you join the rowing club? Little Chinese girl. She said, because there wouldn't be any other Chinese in it. Whoa. So she's made a deliberate development choice to go and join the rowing club so she can integrate, so she can learn, so she can practice her English, so she can get a handle on what's going on out there with the people that might, or people like the people that might end up employing her. So, some of this is not politically correct at all, and I think even the Diversity Council that we're involved with would kick me in the arse for some of these expressions, but I like to call it consciously integrate. Now, is there some stuff that Brian should be doing? Yes. Again, are we going to wait for Brian? I don't recommend it if you really want to get your career going. Consciously integrate. And there's a whole bunch of stuff you can do around that. It's very much tied to get out of your cultural comfort zone. So I encourage people who are from whatever background to get out of their comfort zones to succeed, because people are always stuck in different patterns of behaviour. But if your pattern of behaviour is cultural, it's not normal to speak up. In the Australian business environment, if you're culturally not predisposed to speaking up, that's generally not going to work well for you in an Australian workplace. I'm sure plenty of you have progressed in your careers, so you'd understand what I'm saying. It's expected, it's culturally expected that you speak up, stand up, you promote yourself, you promote your achievements. That's tough for some people generally, and for some people from some cultures. Volunteering, don't wait to be asked, be confident and bold. A bunch of things that I put down that I think may not come naturally to some people that are pivotal. To those people that do that stuff will often succeed. Look at Jeffrey. I see Jeffrey as pretty confident and bold. He's made some deliberate choices in what he's done to get where he is. And that takes work. It takes work for all of us. understanding the social stuff. Like, there's this kind of misnomer, I think that, I come to work, I do my work, I do it well. I don't like going to the pub, I don't even drink. I don't really like the football or the cricket or whatever. I've got my own hobbies, I've got my family, I've got my life. I'll come in, I'll do my work, I'll work better than anyone in the place, and I'll produce really great stuff, and I am going to succeed because of that. I would suggest you're probably not. Is that right? Maybe not. But it's the reality, because it's more about, it's like being part of a family. It's more about it's as much about getting to know other people and building relationships and building their confidence, being known, as it is about doing the work. Because that will get you opportunities. And I've seen time and again, sometimes the person who's loudest gets the promotion and they're not necessarily the best. Is that right? No. Is that what happens? Yes. So, all of those things are really fundamental to career success. What else do I have there? And I think the cool thing about this is if you get out of your comfort zone and you can do this, I think not only will your career expand, but your life will expand. You're seeking out new experiences and seeking out points of difference. Interestingly, I was talking to Jeffrey and it occurred to me, Jeffrey's a sales guy. I'm really a sales guy at heart. I was an accountant, but I'm reformed. A classic sales technique is adapting to your audience, adapting to your potential buyer or potential customer. Now, you can choose not to do that. Absolutely, you can stand and say, well, I'm not that sort of person. I'm not going to get into a banter about that. I'm going to stick to what I am and who I am. You probably won't get the sale. So, a classic technique is adapting to what, and really selling, going into the employment market, you are selling yourself. So some of the sales techniques are very relevant in that process. Jeffrey said, I don't like football, but I learn enough about football so I can engage with my clients. I used to do that all the time. All right, that's just number one. Number two, I think I mentioned communication skills once or twice through the presentation. Now, I've spoken to a bunch of you. The people I spoke to have got terrific communication skills in the main, but two messages. One, for the younger folk coming through who haven't, this is more important than the technical skills. Yes, you've got to have a base level of technical skills in what you do, but it is more important to your career success to develop this than anything, I believe. The other thing is for those of you who are progressing, don't stop. And that, whether that's you're a native English speaker and you want to be able to talk to a room like this, if you really want to progress, if you want to be a great leader and manager, you need to be a great communicator. There is no question you need to be a great communicator. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you need to be Martin Luther King, but you need to be a good communicator. You need to be able to sit across one-to-one with a direct report who's having a breakdown and understand the subtleties of the communication that's going on. And if English is not your first language, that can be really difficult. And you can screw that up. You can make it worse. You can miss the point. So there's a lot of subtleties. How are we going for time? Not good?
Just over an hour.
Okay. 47 hours. We're almost there. There's two more. How many did I say? 48. I'm really cutting it down today. I had a candidate who was a financial controller. So she's about 150K level position she was going for. Terrific lady. I had a client who was an IT company with their subsidiary in North Sydney and their head office in the UK. And I saw her on paper and I'm like, oh man, you are the one for this job. You've got the experience they're looking for, the achievements are coming through, it's awesome. So then I met with her. And she was originally, I think, from Hong Kong. And man, did I have trouble understanding her. And I'd spoken to loads of people from loads of backgrounds, but I was really struggling. And she had been here for 10 years. And it's so not what I expected. That was probably the biggest part of the shock, because I'd seen her CV. I knew she'd worked in Australia for 10 years. I'm thinking, this is kind of sweet. I probably didn't, because little secret, when we ring you up, when recruiters ring you up and they just sort of want to check a few details on your CV, they're often checking how you're coming across, because communication skills are such a problem. That'll be the first check. Oh, it's just a quick call to just confirm a few details, and we'll get back to you when we've finished going through the initial process, or not. So anyway, going back to this lovely lady. So I really struggled, and I'm like, oh man, but she's just perfect skill set for the role. So being a very open and honest recruiter, which is unusual, I rang my client and I said, look, I just want to talk to you about this one candidate. Look, I think she's terrific, da-da-da-da, she's got all this stuff. But I just have to tell you, when I met with her, I was sort of surprised. She's very heavily accented, and at times I had some trouble understanding her. I just wanted to, see if you're okay with that, whatever. And because I was quite honest, he said, all right, I'll meet with her. So he actually did all right with it. Because I'd prepped him, he wasn't surprised. And he kind of got through. He said, I think I can work around that. He was the Australian MD. I went, fantastic. I'm getting close to my feet. No. I wanted her to get the job. No, I did. But, this is good. In recruitment, it's all about the buzz of success and getting people across the line and helping them on their career paths and all that. Anyway, the final interview was with the finance director in the UK by phone. And I was like, oh, well, the MD's okay. He's obviously got, pull. He's gonna get it through. Sure enough, I spoke to the MD and the finance director in the UK, and he actually had the casting vote, and he said no. And he said no because I'm going to be talking to her on the phone all the time, and because phone's much harder, right? Can't see the person. I'm going to be talking to her all the time. I'm going to need to know updates on financials and ratios, and I cannot afford to have any miscommunication. She didn't get the job. And she'd been here for 10 years, and I thought, well, if I'd had a conversation with her earlier like this, and she kept developing, she thought she's in a job, she's in a good finance job, getting paid well, and I don't need to do any more. I disagree. And it didn't. Did you tell her as a reason why she didn't get the job? I told her. Absolutely, I told the client, I told her word for word what the finance director told me. Because it's a competency. And what was her feedback to you about it? She was like shocked. Because no one had ever said that to her before. When I first started this business, I went and spoke to my old mates in recruitment, and I tried to train them how to have those conversations, because they need to. And it was difficult. But, she was sort of shocked. She had to take it away and kind of digest it. I'm really disappointed. And I was like disappointed with her too, because she hadn't done the development work. Finding alternative paths is another tip to take on board. So, in the event that there's a young candidate in this situation like Jun, well, he hasn't done the work, so he should go off and develop his skills where he needs to and do that, deliberate integration. But equally, that you can see the traditional recruitment path is the absolute toughest one for someone in that situation. So there are a bunch of other ways to go about getting a job. Now I suggest trying all of them, but networking is a huge one. It can be a fantastic shortcut, and they get to know you in a situation like this before ever seeing a CV and having to go through that horrible process competing against 5,000 other applicants. So they've seen more of your substance straight away than just form. So it's a great way to cut through. You've got to do a lot of it to get anywhere. Volunteering, getting involved in all sorts of forums, putting your hand up, even if you're in a workplace at the moment, getting exposed across the organisation is another fantastic way to keep moving your career and developing. Internal moves are always better than external moves because they know what you can do. They're not judging you on form, they're judging you on substance. And for people who haven't got any experience, we've had great success with interns stepping into an organisation. It's a really low-risk way for a host company to I guess, sample, get comfortable with a student from an international background. They're not paying for the intern and they don't pay for our service. What they have to do is support them and supervise them and all that sort of stuff. But we've now got, I think, a 46% higher rate of our interns get a job with the host company. Now, to me, that's a testimony. And most of those, I've got some of our internship team up the back, most of those employers would say, look, if this was a permanent job, I wouldn't hire Sally, who I just interviewed for the internship, but it's an internship, so I'll take her on. And then they ring up halfway through and they're like, oh, Sally's fantastic. We love Sally. She's really fitting in. She's so keen and her work's great. So by experiencing, they take a different view. And finally, as a manager or a leader, I think it's about having brave conversations with and taking on the case to support others like Jeffrey, did when he set this up. Because people aren't having this conversation out there. I think, try to recruit more on substance. We should all do that. And there's a dozen ways to do that using, all sorts of tools and just thinking about, the experience that you can have beyond the form. And recognising that you can train for gaps. This is just like Excel, folks. Takes a little bit longer, but people have been learning languages for hundreds of years. Every single person in this room could speak fluent Spanish with enough training and work and effort and practice. And also recognising the advantages of having a more culturally diverse workforce. And there's a whole bunch of stuff. I encourage you to look at the Diversity Council report on that. But businesses are slowly waking up to that. Who knew this would go long? Finally, this is the solution piece, I suppose, which we really can't solve what Brian's doing in the short term. Education sector slowly developing, but I think the education piece we can address is self-development and really taking on the development of soft skills, but you'll only find that if someone has a brave conversation with you, like what we're having tonight, understanding the importance, getting help. There's a bunch of ways to develop your communication skills. And therefore a good experience that then leads to more of a comfort factor for Brian and others when they're hiring. So we can actually make a difference to this thing just by starting with a brave conversation. Thanks for listening.